Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read Initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today we have Elana Gordon from Illinois joining us. She is a 24-year veteran teacher, and we are focusing on discussing her journey today as an educator, with the time spent seeing how approaches to reading have changed and the journey that you've taken as an individual for your lifelong learning. So let's go back to the beginning. I mean, we're talking about reading. So do you remember learning how to read?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, but not really. When that question comes up often when we're relearning about the science of reading, that's like one of the things people ask. And I think reading was just really easy for me. So I don't really remember struggling with it. I don't remember exactly how it was taught in school. I think we had maybe some phonics groups in there, but I mean, I just remember picking it up pretty quickly and just loving to read as a child, just jumping right into books and reading them on my own all the time. So I didn't really that was part of the reason I didn't really probably understand the struggles that a lot of students had, because I didn't find reading challenging for myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what we're seeing, throughout things going on with various teachers. Now, so you don't remember learning how to read. You don't remember exactly how you were taught? But
I mean, I knew we had like the red group or the bluebird group and, different groups. And I think I was always in a high level group. And I think there was some phonics thrown in there, but I think, I just read so much on my own. I was a voracious reader that I just, I think all those things that happen, you expand your vocabulary, you have this love of reading, and you just kind of go with it. So I think, I remember a little bit of like learning some of those phonics skills, but it wasn't like such a heavy influence. It doesn't really stick out to me.
mm-hmm. Now, as you made your way to school, I'm assuming you enjoyed it?
I did, yeah. Yeah, I loved reading. I loved those Nancy Drew books. Probably dating myself. All those kinds of things. I loved mysteries. I found like content reading was a little more challenging. It wasn't like an interest of mine until I was older. So, yeah, but I found school pretty, I enjoyed going to school. I enjoyed reading in school, things like that.
Wonderful. Did you have an idea what you wanted to do after school when you finished high school?
Yeah, actually, I went to college thinking I was going to go into the business world. I enjoyed accounting. I liked marketing, things like that. So my first year I spent in the business school, kind of taking some classes, and just realized it wasn't for me, and kind of was a little bit lost as to what I would do next. That feeling of what's out there for you. So I kind of just stepped back and thought about what had interested me in the past. And I had done a little bit of coaching through athletics, and realized I really liked working with kids. Nobody in my family, my immediate family, had ever been a teacher. So it wasn't something like I had grown up with. But I decided I would give that a shot. And then I joined the education department at my university, and I really enjoyed working with kids. And so that became kind of how I stumbled into teaching, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So did you do a post-baccalaureate program or?
Yeah, so I graduated my undergrad, and then I started teaching in Cicero, Illinois, and I did that in an intermediate classroom. Like I was a 5th, 6th grade teacher, and that was when I started to realize I had intermediate kids who were struggling to read, and I didn't really have a lot of good strategies. A lot of those classes were like about children's literature, or I don't really remember taking a whole lot of assessment classes or foundational skills classes, things like that. A lot of my practicums worked with older kids. So I remember a lot of things around content area. But that was when I decided I had an interest in literacy, because I wanted to learn how to help those kids. And so I went back to school and got my master's degree in a reading endorsement so I could go into the literacy department in our district.
Mhm.
And I became a literacy support teacher at the time. And that kind of, those teachers supported other teachers. They went into classrooms, they co-taught, we modeled lessons, things like that. And then I also was like a part-time interventionist at the same time. So I got to work with struggling readers and still in an intermediate setting. And that was still eye-opening because even after all of that training, I had some great mentors, but I never could get solid answers on, like what were the best strategies to use, or why were these kids always struggling? Like they didn't seem to be getting anywhere. I think we did a lot of good work with comprehension and reading around content at the time that I started. But in terms of filling in those gaps and deficits, we didn't really know what to do. So that kind of just kind of propelled my journey in literacy, I guess.
So your training in your master's in the professional development didn't have this explicit systematic instruction that we see in the science of reading and balanced literacy. I remember when we spoke earlier, you mentioned that it was a lot of focus on the 3 cueing and the leveled text. When you were using these strategies, what were you thinking about? Like, did you think that it was helping the students? As a teacher, like what were you noticing as you're doing this?
I mean, I think like a lot of people, we, as kids, were looking at the picture and then filling, knowing those words, it appeared like they were reading, right? Like, so and some kids did come in and they picked up reading pretty easily, that 60% or so that, or 50% that just will learn to read no matter what, right? So I think like a lot of that was misleading because we saw kids that were successful when we were in a balanced literacy mode. And so we thought, okay, those kids are picking it up. So we continued to do some of those practices. I think sometimes we were stumped, like kids became lifers, we called them, in interventions or in your classroom. And we just couldn't figure out, how to move them. And they seemed very stuck. And so, we analyzed running records and we had a ton, but there was so much professional development and everything was called research-based and, best practice. And you went and you heard from experts in the field, and so I never really saw, the evidence-based research that I'm looking at now for behind the body of, the science of reading. And so I didn't really, think that stuff was inaccurate. We had reading recovery come into our district, and so we had reading recovery trained teachers. We used Mari Clay's observation survey. We learned a lot about Fontes and Pinnell and the benchmark assessment and assessing, but we always had conversations like, what is this really telling us? Teachers would ask me I became a coach shortly after. When we moved into balanced literacy, I became a literacy coach at a building, and teachers would always ask, what are the look-fors exactly that move you from level E to level F? And we really struggled to answer that question. I think we did some good practices. We used interactive writing. We had shared reading. There was some phonemic awareness. Like we used Heggerty at the time because it was left over from the Reading First days that we were a part of. But nothing really was connected. We didn't have a good curriculum or scope and sequence around foundational skills. And when the Common Core state standards were adopted, we kind of just focused on comprehension standards, like literature standards and informational standards. And we kind of even almost ignored, I'd say, the language and listening standards as well as foundational skill standards. They weren't part of our grading system. They weren't part of things teachers reported on. So those things kind of got lost in the shuffle, I think. And towards the end of my coaching years, I was a coach for about 10, 11 years. And towards the end, we adopted Jan Richardson's Next Steps in Guided Reading, which I know is pretty big. And we adopted her program called Literacy Footprints. And, even then, like she had look-fors and that had some more phonics infused, I'd say, into those lessons. and I think we grasped at those because we didn't have enough of that. We weren't getting that anywhere else. And so we really like latched onto those, and that went district wide, and it spread building to building, and everybody was using these lessons, but kids were still not progressing the way they should have been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that must have been frustrating. And there once was a mindset that it's okay if not everybody learns how to read, and that there will be non-responders. There will be kids that just can't learn how to read. And while that's still true, there is a very small percentage of individuals who do not have the cognitive capacity to learn how to read. If they cannot comprehend spoken language at an adequate level, it is very difficult. This doesn't mean they have to be verbal. They can be non-speaking and have a high comprehension level and still learn how to read. But it's adjusting our expectations and how to teach them. So what do you think was that first step into structured literacy or the science of reading for you?
Well, around the COVID time, I started, I went back to being an interventionist right around that time. So I was a building literacy coach and then moved back into interventions because I wanted to work more directly with students. So during that time, through these video lessons or these online lessons, I was really noticing, how much my students, like that speech to print that part seemed missing. And so I started trying out, we had Heggerty, so I started using a little bit more of that. But I also, with my older students, Heggerty came out with something called Bridge the Gap, which was their older lessons for older students that had more like substitution, deletion, manipulation, things like that. And so there was a really nice assessment in there as well that I began using, and I tried it out with some students. And then I also started wondering, like, all those years that we had not used decodable readers, and we had said that they didn't make sense and they didn't have a storyline and they weren't as good as level text. I started thinking, like, is that really true? And so I started trying out some decodable texts that had, were centered around word families. So it was kind of more of an analytic approach to phonics as opposed to like synthetic. But so I was using that, but then we would move from our decodables and things like that, but we still were trying to memorize sight words, and we were still then moving into a level text. And so then I saw some progress, but I wasn't seeing, like, it was kind of like being in both camps, like two worlds. Like I was trying out some structured literacy materials, but not like, or theories, but not everything. And so I saw some success with students, but I still was wondering more. So at that time, we had this reading curriculum committee, and we were starting to look at foundational skills standards and how we could incorporate those into our district, because we had known for years that that was a missing piece. And so through working on that committee and then starting to become more interested in that area, a colleague of mine, another coach, we read A Fresh Look at Phonics by Wiley Blevins, and we decided to do a summer PD on it. And so we had been trying out some of the practices in his book with our kids, and then we did a summer PD that summer, and it was well received, I think. And then at that same time, we had a new literacy director come to our district, and that fall he pulled the interventionists together, and he asked us to consider, one, he showed us the research behind the science of reading, and he asked us to consider, like, examining the research for ourselves and really taking it in and thinking about it and what we had been doing, and also what could we really accomplish with kids in this time frame that we had, this 30 minutes. And so after doing that and really reading the research myself and seeing some and getting some PD on it, I realized, like, it made so much more sense to me than anything ever had before. Like, it almost like made all the puzzle pieces click, So I started, reading everything. I started listening to Emily Hanford's podcasts and Amplify the Science of Reading podcasts. And we were trained to use a core diagnostic survey and the PAST screener. And so I really delved into learning more about phonemic awareness and how much that impacted children's learning to read. And so those, we built out, they had built out a framework for us to use, and we called it a word recognition framework. And I started using that we had a choice. We could use it and try it out slowly with one group of students, or we could do it with everybody. And, and so I decided, like, there was no point. I had already spent a year doing kind of both worlds. There was no point in waiting. So I tried it out with all of my students and found a lot of success. Kids who had been stuck at a level D book that were now in 4th grade were suddenly learning all of these phonics skills and phoneme grapheme combinations, and they were reading. They went from reading one sentence on a page to paragraphs on a page of decodable text. And it was amazing to see that kind of growth. And I think, like what everybody says, the more success you see with children, the more, excited you are to continue learning. And so that learning for me just kind of, deepened. Like, I started going to symposiums and conferences around the science of reading in the area. I did some online stuff I did the Pennsylvania one and the Patent Symposium. I went to Ortley from Oregon. They do a lot of work with MTSS. And I started reading everything I could get my hands on. I joined the Reading League and got their journal and started reading it. I read Reading Research Quarterly. And it's just fascinating, all the things we had missed all along the way. And so I just kind of fell in love with the science of reading. And it was exciting because I was an interventionist. I could take what I was learning and put it into practice, like the next day. And so I was able to do that. And I enjoyed it, and kids were being successful. And so as a teacher, I felt successful too. And I just kind of ran with it. So our district did a good job too along the way. Like I said last time, we were making this shift, and we started to have podcast meetings around the science of reading. We were offered letters training. And so I went through letters training, and those were lots of big aha moments for me. And then it just kind of, spiraled from there, I guess.
Yeah, and I want to take a moment and do a bit of a backtrack where you're talking about doing the salt and peppering of some of the phonics stuff using the decodables, but then going back to, the balanced literacy. And I want to highlight that this is something that we're seeing all over the place, and especially some of the bigger commercial programs that have been around for decades. And schools have spent millions of dollars on purchasing their products and their curriculum, that they're taking it to salt and pepper it in, right? A little bit here, a little bit there. But the thing with structured literacy or the science of reading, whatever you want to call it, when we're using information about how the brain learns how to read, it's an all-in approach. Now, yes, it does take time to master, but you can't just say, okay, well, we're going to do it this way for one part of the day, but the rest we're going to still promote the guessing and various methods for word attack that are not actually decoding the word. And it's recognizing that this knowledge takes time to build, and it takes time for practices to change.
Yeah, I think along the lines of what you're saying, I think the most haunting comment that I can think of a child during that time was they would look at me through the computer and they would just say, like, we get to the level text and they'd be like, I just can't remember the words. Mm-hmm. And I can still hear them say that, and I would think, but you're not remembering the words. Nobody could do that. That's nearly impossible. You can only learn so many. But that's what they thought. They thought reading was memorizing these words, and we were not doing a good enough job showing them how to, use their skills, sound out words, and use, those graphemes to figure out how to break up words. And so the more comments like that was when I started thinking, like, both worlds, you can't do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Like phonics and leveled texts, it's not that we didn't have any, it was just very opportunistic. It was whatever that book we thought you could teach from, and that there was no systematics, to that and thinking. And so we were all over the place, so we had it's not that we didn't do anything right or that we didn't have some good practices. They just didn't align, and they weren't systematic. And so they weren't supporting children. And I have found that through, moving through a scope and sequence, using, decodable text with my early readers, and then, moving them along that continuum is much more effective and accelerates their growth, their progress too. And so, yeah, that's what it made me think of.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're working with students in the intermediate grade level primarily, is that correct?
Well, I've since moved to a K-6 building, so I work with kindergarten through 6th grade.
Yeah, but when you were focusing on those grade 4 and grade 5 students, we have to recognize that the huge gap between struggling readers at that level and their peers is ginormous.
Yeah.
Especially, and it's not only the reading skill itself, but it's the comprehension and the vocabulary building. When we look at grade 4 and grade 5, so we're looking at kids that are 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, the amount of intensive intervention that they need to catch up to their peers is a lot. And it's a lot more than most schools have the resources to provide, which is unfortunate. And we're making the changes now to help support them so we don't get there. But recognizing these kids are going to need 80 hours of intensive instruction in a year if we want to try and catch them up or get them closer to their peers, and recognize the loss of vocabulary development because they're not reading like their peers are.
Yeah, I mean, we have found that too, right? There are significant gaps with our intermediate students, but I will say that this past year we piloted, at least in my building, we piloted Amplify CKLA, and so a lot of those students that were in some of those grades that got to pilot there, they were exposed to a lot of higher level vocabulary and learning like that, and so a lot of it too for some of the kids. Fortunately, for some of them, they have good language and vocabulary. They came in with that. And so what was missing was more of that, the phonics skills and those gaps. And so as we started to fill those gaps, some of those kids are bouncing back. Not all of them, but some of them. So it's nice to see that, some of those kids have a good shot of catching their peers after, a little bit, some intervention work like that.
Of course, and it is not impossible to get these kids reading. I speak from personal experience. I did not learn how to read until the intermediate grades of school. So it can be done. It takes a lot of work and dedication and support from outside individuals. And students are very lucky that they're in a position where they're getting to access you, someone who's passionate about what they're doing and has the knowledge base. Now, what would you say are the big things that influenced your transition, like those big books or names or experiences that really helped you along your way?
I'd say I really like the book Structured Literacy Interventions by Louise Spears Swirling. I thought they did a great job of each chapter tackles a different type of learning and what you can do with it. I think when I first started out, Know Better, Do Better by Meredith and David Lieben was a good solid book, especially when you're first starting out. They've got really practical strategies. Each chapter focuses on a different aspect of reading, and it's an easy read. I went through like a whole long, for phonemic awareness, I read a lot of David Kilpatrick's work. I Equipped for Success. I read Essentials of Assessing and Preventing and Overcoming Reading Difficulties. Louisa Moats, which is way more technical, Speech to Print, but once I started down the path, it was kind of hard to stop. So I did a little bit of everything. I read some of the more straightforward books, and then I've read, then I've started branching out. Like, I think reading Above the Fray by Dr. Julia Lindsay is a really good one for when you're starting out. She takes things that you might have done in balanced literacy and shows you how to shift them to a more structured literacy approach. And I think she calls them swaps. She swaps this for that, and it's an easy read. And she also has on her website really good decodables that are available for teachers. Because we have a high multilingual population, I read Literacy Foundations for English Learners by Elsa Cardenas Hagen. And
I love that one.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I feel like there was nothing essentially so new in it for me that I hadn't learned because we had gotten a lot of professional development in my district, but it was a good reminder of all the things we should be doing and how to access those points for our multilingual learners and second language learners. So I feel like everybody should read that one. I think that Dr. Jan Hasbrook is really has influenced a lot of what I've learned about. I attend some of her webinars. Wiley Blevins is like that to me. I think his stuff is really practical. Anita Archer and her explicit instruction is another one. I feel like I could go on and on. I have like this whole list of notes of everything. I just think that there's so much out there and available if you're interested and you want to make this change. And I know it doesn't happen overnight. You know, when I first started reading, I read Karen Chenoweth's work, Districts That Succeed and Schools That Succeed. And there's this quote in there that kind of resonates with me all the time, that when students fail, something needs to change. But, you know, we're not blaming the adults unless that when you find that out, you're not willing to change. And so I feel like once we figured out like what we were doing wasn't working and supporting children, and we had something that was researched and we could see what your brain was doing, there was no reason not to. You know, we weren't benefiting by not making a shift. And so I think that you have to kind of then jump all in. You know, since then, I've found lots of different podcasts. Yours was one of the first ones I listened to as well. I really enjoy all the different voices that you have. And so I've expanded, you know, Sold a Story when that came out, kind of described my district to a T. That was exactly who we were. I read tons of blogs and articles. I think I'm on Twitter every day and I just send myself like 10 articles a day, and you get to it when you get to it. But there's just lots of good stuff. The science behind how our brain learns to read, you know, Stanislaus Dehaene and people like that. Like, I like reading about the science. It's really interesting. It's a much slower read. Like, that stuff is intense and it can get messy and complicated, but it's very eye-opening to learn about what's happening. And I always have a list of like next. So like currently I'm reading 10 Success Factors for Literacy Instruction by Susan Hall. I'm really excited to order Lindsay Kemany's new book, 7 Mighty Moves, because she's got little video links for educators on what this looks like in a classroom. I'm in the middle of Morphine Magic by Deb Glazer. So those are all, she has a new book out for the little ones. So I feel like I'm just always constantly looking for the next thing I can research or learn about, because in the end, it's just helping my kids. And one of the things that I guess I'm kind of proud of in my district is I decided that, you know, it was nice to, from my own shift, but to share that shift with other educators and to hear other stories and to hear what that looked like going on in my district. I started an in-house podcast district-wide that we send out like every week. And I interview teachers in the district. I interview leadership. I interview school teams. This year, I've stumbled onto some experts in the field that have been willing to share. So I've gotten to meet Wiley Blevins and Maria Murray and Jan Hasbrook and people like that. And, you know, just to hear their wealth of expertise, and then like to hear stories of educators in our district and what does shifting look like in their special ed classroom or their dual language classroom or their gen ed classroom. And so that's been really exciting too. So we just wrapped up season 1 this year, and season 2 will be about our curriculum adoption. So that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, and for listeners, it's called the Road to Reading podcast. Is that publicly available?
Yeah, it gets tweeted out whenever we have like experts on the show. We tweet it out and tag. So there's also a Google Doc where you can access like past the website and past episodes as well. So yeah, it's out on Twitter. You can find it somewhere.
Yeah, social media I think has been mixed blessing when it comes to best practices in instruction.
Yeah, there's a lot out there.
There is, and it's hard to filter through. I don't even know how many browsers I have opened on my computer with multiple tabs of things I want to read next.
I
Uh,
know, I'm exactly the same way. I have like 40 up right now, and they disappeared the other day, and I had a freak out moment, but I was able to get them back.
that's good. Now, your journey isn't over. You're still on it. So, what are your next steps on this journey for your lifelong learning path? And then, how do you plan to start things off in September?
So, immediate future, my district adopted, like I said, CKLA, and we're adopting a more scripted intervention program called M-Class Interventions. And so, one, I'm going to receive training on that in the fall. And that comes with like a dyslexia screener. There's CBMs that we'll be trained on. So, we'll be giving that as a universal screener to all of the students. And then that we'll use that for progress monitoring. So, I'm getting trained on all of that and learning more about those lessons and how they work and how I can put my teacher knowledge to work with those lessons. So, I think that's like a big goal for me this year to see how that gels together, I guess.
Mhm.
In the fall, that's how I'll be starting. I'll be starting out learning about that and then going right into applying that with students, which
Mhm.
is kind of like what I really enjoy doing because you get to see it in action. Um, in the and starting next year too, I applied for a literacy fellowship and I was accepted. So I'm doing a literacy fellowship from the Goyen Literacy Foundation, and we get to tape snippets from our instruction and post them. And the whole point is to share what we're doing with structured literacy so that other educators can benefit. So I'll be involved in that. I'll do some presenting. I'll be meeting the other fellows and learning from them. I hope to continue going to conferences and, doing some of my own learning as well. And my district too is putting on a literacy symposium or institute this summer in July, towards the end of July. We have a big literacy institute where we have experts in the field coming. I think Joan Sedita is coming, and some other big names. And so I'm excited to attend that and hear what they have to say. And I guess that's the immediate future. And then I just hope to continue to put this into practice and see the results, and continue to learn about, we started with a word recognition framework. I know my district has built out a fluency. After talking to Dr. Matthew Burns, we built out kind of like a fluency framework that we're starting to put in place, and we're working our way towards comprehension as well. What does that look like in interventions? So I'm eager to hear, where are we going with these things and how do they all come together? And then to continue to see the results, like how does that shift, learning for our children, and also to see how we adopted a knowledge building curriculum for a reason, and to see how that threads through over time and what our kids will gain from that. So those are all the exciting things going on in Cicero. And the other piece of that is when I joined the Reading League and became a Reading League ambassador. And in my area, I live about an hour away from where I work. So I'm a Reading League ambassador for the northern part of Illinois, but I work in Cook County. And so I do some, trying to bring people into the Reading League. And just this week, I did a lunch and learn presentation for them. So I'm excited to continue advocating for children. I think that's become a passion of mine. Illinois is trying to pass a comprehensive literacy plan, and I have attended a lot of meetings. I started going to some meetings for the Early Literacy Coalition, which does lots of great advocacy work. And so I'm learning a whole lot about that advocacy piece that I never really knew about before, and that's held a big interest for me. And so I hope to do more of that and just to advocate for children learning to read, because it impacts the rest of their life.
It does. And, we have to thank you for taking on that role and going above and beyond the call of duty, especially when it comes to recognizing that teaching can be a very lonely profession. But with the online communities and online support, you can have the help that you need and have the understanding of what you're going through.
Yeah, I think that's been a big part of it. I feel like the science of reading community has been super supportive. When you reach out and ask questions, they answer you. Nancy Hennessy called a coaching friend of mine the other day and walked her through how to write IEPs that align more with the science of reading, which is a new task in our district as well. And so it's just kind of phenomenal. I mean, obviously, I would hope it would be. I mean, our end goal is for all children to read and be literate. So I hope that we're all working together. But to see the camaraderie and that there is a lot of support, like you said, I do feel like I've been supported in my journey. So I guess I'm kind of lucky in that way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today,
Yeah,
Elena. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
thanks for having me.